So Stacy and I, in 2006, we'd been married about a year, and we were just really kind of getting to know our first couple friends, Bob and Aaron, who they'd grown up Catholic, they'd been out of religion for quite a while, but they were actually really receptive and open to conversations with me about faith and spirituality. But this day, we were down at, I think it was like either the dog parade or some kind of festival or something. We turned the corner from Woodland to Indiana, and I saw and heard something that sent my blood pressure through the roof. My chest tightened, I started to sweat, my palms were like real clammy. There was a street preacher with a sign so large, he had the post of it anchored in like a belt anchor, like you do for offshore fishing. This thing was like massive. It was basically like a billboard, but he had it like anchored in his belt. And it read, "Turn or burn, repent from your wicked ways." And then, I kid you not, enumerated, had to have been like 60 or 80 different vices or behaviors or like groups of people that were apparently, according to this guy, offensive to God. And the ones I remember were tattoos. Ugh, terrible. Sports fans, any football fans? And then pot-smoking dirty devils. I just like the way that kind of roll. That seemed pretty great. Part of the reason, and half the room. So part of the reason I remember it is our friend Bob was not only an avid Boston Red Sox fan, but the reason I knew that was because of the giant Boston Red Sox tattoo that was on his leg. So I'm like, oh God, this is terrible. On top of which, this guy is shouting, everybody listed, they're all going to hell. So of course, this is like a year and a half into my first full-time ministry gig, and I think clearly, in my wisdom, I'll be the one who can diffuse the situation, and me and this gentleman will reach a rational understanding of how things are. So he comes at me with the full barrage of Christian interrogation. If you die tonight, where are you going to go? And what do you believe about da, da, da? How would you answer the question? In this situation, what do you think about X, Y, and Z? Finally, I stop him, and I say, hey, man, I know what you're thinking. Yes, the history of successful diplomacy always starts with, hey, man. So I give like this subtle little lean in and I go, hey man, we're on the same team. I'm a pastor. He doesn't even miss a beat. He's like, I don't care. I'm not talking about a job. I'm talking about the truth. And go right back at me. And so finally, I try and listen for a while and get a word in. And finally, I get so frustrated, I decide, you know what, I'm going to walk away. So I get about 10 yards away and he shouts after me, you know there are going to be a lot of pastors in hell. And without missing a beat, I turn around and I go, yeah, and I bet there's going to be a lot of street preachers in hell too. So maybe not one of my finer moments. I'm still proud of the comeback. But I think we've all had these conversations in which discussion of religion, theology, doctrine, the right thinking, the proper sort of biblical interpretation is made more important than the person on the other end of the conversation. And so for me, this story always reminds me that whatever we think about this word sin, I think we have to frame it not as much in terms of a list of vices or immoral behaviors as a life that is out of sync with love, and especially the supreme hypocrisy to say you know God and to live a life without love. All the superior moral judgments, but no love. So we are reading, as Heather mentioned, from the letter of 1 John, and it opens, I think it's been like 4 weeks now, or 5 weeks, which is crazy. It opens with this sort of ecstatic exclamation that this community has experienced the life that Jesus said was possible, and they want to share it. That's why they're writing this letter. And then they use this image of light and darkness. Light reveals something, it makes something known or illuminates it. And we said last week, this is actually an invitation to live in reality, meaning we're not talking about abstract theological ideas. We're talking about concrete material in this life, in this world, reality, which is why the letter opens with all these metaphors, what we have seen, what we have heard, what we have touched. Right? This has happened to us in our experience. So we're going to come back to the sin stuff, but that actually won't make any sense unless we address the commands, and that makes a little bit more sense with some context. So the passage just before this, and I think it's actually on your sheet, I think 8 to 10 of chapter 1, is just a bunch of conditional if statements. If this, then that. And if that, then this. And if that, then that. And so you get the feeling, if you were to read through it on your first read, you would go, there's something going on here. There's something hovering around the edges. Like this person's writing something, but we're really not privy to whatever it is that's happening. And so the general agreement among scholars of 1 John is that there is some sort of controversy going on in this early church. There's a debate, there's a heated discussion of some kind. In fact, some say this has gotten so severe that one group has chosen to leave the main group. Some suggest there's a faction. This is phenomenal. Now, we got to be fair. We don't have both sides of the argument here. What we have is the authors of this letter. But the general agreement, even though we only have one side, is that the disagreements here are sort of around 3 points. Number one, they're arguing about the nature of Jesus, the extent to which Jesus is human, Jesus is divine. What does that even mean? How does it work? Is he special? To what extent? To what degree? And then they're also arguing about these words, sin and salvation. Not the words. They sort of agree the words are important. They can't agree on what they mean, how they function, how pervasive, how exclusive, how inclusive. They can't get their agreement wrapped around what that is. And then also, finally, and this is sort of continuing to be rehashed, it seems like, through the scriptures, the command to love your neighbor. How far does that command extend? And that may sound familiar. That's sort of the very question Jesus gets in the Gospels. Who is my neighbor? He says, or how do I have life? He says, love your neighbor. And the guy says, who is my neighbor? Meaning, how far does my obligation to love my neighbor extend? So they're arguing about the nature of Jesus, sin and salvation, and the love of neighbor. These conflicts become so severe that apparently one group has maybe even walked away. They've left. So, side note, in the very earliest pictures we have of the church, there is disagreement. There is conflict. And I know you've got to try, but you may even have to close your eyes. Time travel with me back thousands of years. Strain to imagine a church where people disagree. Right? We're talking about the kind of place where people understand the very same words, the very same language in entirely different ways. They can sit together at a table and read the very same story and arrive at drastically different meanings. Why is it important? What is it saying? The interesting thing is, rather than being disturbing, to me this is actually profoundly comforting, because we live in the Western world that has inherited the Christian tradition in terms of understanding that what we're doing is trying to trace back or uncover a singular black and white truth, trying to trace back the one thing the tradition's been trying to say all along. But in actuality, this is the tradition, the fighting, the disagreement, the wrestling. This is what we've inherited. People have been wrestling with the fundamental questions of the Christian faith since before it was called the Christian faith. What we've inherited is not a list of clear answers upon which everyone agrees. We've inherited the wrestling. We've inherited the call to do our very best, to offer our most faithful attempts to reply to the sacred questions, not to pretend that we all agree about the answers. And the posture, I think, the attitude with which we wrestle is actually much more important than whatever answers we think we found. Or we might say it is much more important how we know than even what we know. How do we hold and practice our beliefs, not just which beliefs make it on that list? Spoiler alert, the answer is love. So let me explain how I get there, because it seems really simple. It's actually not. So the phrase, and the entire passage turns on this phrase, we know that we have come to know him if we keep his commands. So this is actually the first instance of the word commands in the letter of 1 John. And so we kind of go, okay, well, he's using the word commands. Is he using that to refer to anything? But we know that 1 John is very often referring back to the Gospel of John. And if we look at the Gospel of John, we actually do find in John 13 the use of this word commands. This is in the farewell discourse, so Jesus talking to the disciples before the crucifixion. We find the use of the word commands multiple times right in a row. And it actually really helps understand how John understands, this John community understands commands, and then what that means for the letter of 1 John. So just a few examples. A new command, this is Jesus talking, by the way. A new command I give you, love one another. As I have loved you, so you must love one another. By this, everyone will know that you are my disciples, if you love one another. So command, love. A few verses later, my command is this: love each other as I have loved you. Greater love has no one than this, than to lay down your life for your friends. And then just 5 verses later, this is my command: love each other. Command, love, command, love, command, love. You're probably picking up a pattern here. So when we get to the letter of 1 John and we read the word command, even though it hasn't shown up in the letter yet, everyone reading the letter of 1 John goes, oh, command, love. Oh, command means love. And if you keep reading, we'll actually tackle this next week. The very next passage begins, we're not writing you a new command, but an old command. And then he sort of can't get his head around it. It's not an old command, it's actually a new command. But you find out it's really all about love. And so let me reread the passage that we have tonight with this context and see if it makes a little more sense. We know that we have come to know him if we keep his commands, love. Whoever says, I know him, but does not do what he commands, love, is a liar, and the truth is not in that person. But if anyone obeys his word to love, the love of God is truly made complete in them. This is how we know him. Are in him. Whoever claims to live in him must live as Jesus did. And we could say, well, how did Jesus live? In love. In fact, he even says, love one another as I have loved you. And so the passage goes on, when we live by this command to love, really neat phrase. It says, the love of God is made complete in you. Some translations say is made mature in you. So this word complete in the Greek is actually really fascinating. I think it actually does a very good job of sort of holding the tension of the fullness of the Jewish mysticism of John's community, even as it's translated into Greek. It does a good job of resisting sort of the duality, the binary, this and that. And the word is teleos, from which we get teleology, which you still may not be familiar with, but it has to do with purpose. It has to do with the directive, the principle, or the goal of things. Like, what's the point of a thing? What's the point of X, Y, or Z? So that's what teleology has to do with. So in one sense, we could say it has to do with a thing's use. This is called extrinsic teleology. So this clicker, right, its purpose is to click, to advance slides. The goal, the purpose is imposed by, and it is for, and it is completed in its current form and human use. All that to say, the clicker's meant to click. That's what it's for. That's its purpose. That's all it does. That's what it does. But there is also such a thing as intrinsic teleos, or teleology. The example here is like an acorn. Its ultimate purpose, the end goal of an acorn, its intrinsic directive, it's actually even got DNA to ensure this, is not to be an acorn. Its intrinsic teleos is to be a fully grown tree. And you've got to make sure you get what's going on here, let me put it this way. The author is saying, remember how the letter began, we've experienced the life that Jesus said was possible. Seen it, heard it, looked at it, touched it, lived it. Here's what we know. Here's the point of everything that Jesus was doing, the end goal, the directive, the purpose, the principle under it all, where the whole thing is headed, is love. That's it. It's love. And in fact, we might say the acorn of God's love reaches maturity, completion, teleos. It only becomes a fully grown tree in the love of people. There is no such thing, actually, as the complete love of God or the mature love of God as something apart from people loving other people. That actually doesn't exist, according to the author of 1 John, because it doesn't say the love of God is complete when you believe the right things about the death of Jesus, or the love of God is complete when you pray the right way, or the love of God is complete when you find a church, or the right form of worship, or the right sort of belief structure. No. It says the love of God is teleos when you love. When you love. Now, this is an important point of clarity, because in one phrase, he's saying the love of God is made mature, right, or complete. But then in another phrase, he's saying don't sin, but when you do sin. So how does that work? Interestingly, and this is why I really like this word teleos, I think it's pretty flexible, it doesn't mean without flaws. Teleos doesn't mean perfection in the modern Western sense of fixed or static or unchanging. It doesn't mean a final arrival from which you never move on. Teleos is actually both a state of maturity and it's an ongoing process. So it's not that you're done, it's not that you're finished, right? And you can just punch your ticket and go home because you believed the right things. Thank you very much. Instead, it's this idea that you've reached a state of maturity, but that formation continues. Your journey continues. It's a living, dynamic reality. And so like we said, the acorn's teleos may be to become a fully grown tree, but think about the fully grown tree, right? It's reached its teleos, it's fully grown, but wait, if you keep adding sunlight and water and nutrients and time, even a teleos tree, even a fully grown tree does what? It keeps growing. The bottom line is the goal, the point, the purpose, the dynamic of this whole process is love. And love continues to grow. It grows more and more the more you nurture it, the more you practice it. And you start to get the sense that the message in this letter is building. It's growing even stronger. And even from all the way back in the Gospel of John. Because in the Gospel of John, we have Jesus say, here's the deal. Here's the new command. This is what it's all about. This is actually the singular metric for Christian discipleship and human fidelity to God, love. That's it. That's everything. And then here the John community is saying, now almost 100 years later, they're going, yeah, actually Jesus was onto something. It turns out he was right. The life he shared, the purpose and the point of everything, we've experienced this. The point is love. That's what it's about. And then there's this other word that gets peppered into this passage a couple times, which becomes even more powerful in light of the context. This is sort of strong language. It says, where did that come from? I did it the wrong way. Hold on. Bear with me. Nope. I swear, my changes didn't save. That's what happened, Clarence. I knew I put that slide in the welcome. The changes didn't save. Oh, well, we don't need it. So in the passage, he uses this language, keep, he says once, and then again he says obey. These are sort of like keep the commands, obey the commands. And when you first read it, it sort of feels a bit heavy-handed, but it's the same word. It's teros. So keep the commands, do what you were told, obey the commands, live as Jesus lived. And the word teros would be used for like a warden in a prison. The idea is keeping a vigilant overwatch, eyes wide open, or like somebody defending a wall. This is someone guarding something. The interesting thing is if you think about what it is that word is referring to, keep the command, obey the word, do this, live this. What is this? It's love. Love. He's saying guard love. Guard love. How many of you have heard the word orthodoxy? All right. This is the same root as the word orthodontist. We can all pray that my kids do not have to go to the orthodontist. Ortho, straight or correct. So you go to the orthodontist to get teeth straightened or get teeth corrected. And orthodoxy is the same way. It has to do with straight or correct confession, opinion, belief. And over time, this really has just come to refer to the Christian creeds, that you believe the right things, orthodoxy. But there is another word that is used far less often. How many of you have heard the phrase orthopraxy? Far fewer. So orthopraxy has to do, again, with right or correct, but it's practice. It's not belief, it's practice. This is where we would put love, right action. And so this letter is saying, and you find this in different places in the New Testament. I love this. The letter of James talks a lot about this. The author of the letter is saying, if you have orthodoxy, or if you think rather that you have orthodoxy without love, you have nothing. And in fact, it's worse than you imagined. You're not just immature. He says you're a liar. You can't have orthodoxy without love. You're deceived. You're deluded. If you think you can hold the Christian faith, if you think you can believe the right creeds, you can confess these orthodox theological ideas, but not live in love, you're crazy. It doesn't work that way. Now, how many of you, and this is, so it's interesting, I gave this sermon 3 times at First Methodist this morning. Very different than this room, especially for this question, because I know so many of you. How many of you have had your orthodoxy questioned by another Christian? I can think of like 3 or 4 of you in the room within the last week. This has happened. Okay, right, so that's most of us. I wonder why we're here. So when people talk about orthodoxy and only orthodoxy, when it becomes argumentative and defensive and critical and honestly sometimes pretty aggressive and scary and done totally without love, this is like the street preacher on the corner carving people into different categories and shaming people and calling them to confess some things and believe some things and to pray some things, all in the spirit of anger and insecurity and judgment. This has totally missed the point. Totally missed the point. Now, to be fair, me shouting back, "No, you go to hell," that might not have also been the most mature thing, but this is a process, remember. This is 10 years ago, so I've got plenty of time. What you realize is that the passion, though, behind this paragraph comes from the experience that these writers are going through. That whatever these theological debates, they've begun to fray the edges. They've begun to rip at the fabric of this community. And if you think about the nature of the community, very quickly, we're no longer talking about like abstract beliefs and theological ideas in a vacuum. You're talking about your friends who are sitting next to you. You're talking about people you care about, people who you've been living life with for some period of time. This is a deeply personal and emotional issue for this congregation. Any of these conversations that want to argue doctrine and dogma and who's right and who's wrong, but aren't done in love, we realize very quickly we can't split these. Or else we're no longer, A, we're not talking about the Christian faith anymore, but B, we're definitely not talking about teleos. We're not talking about an agreement among people to move towards maturity, to move towards integrity, to move towards completion. When we try to separate arguments about belief and ideas from the ability to do that in love, we're moving in the wrong direction. I wonder how many of us have been in these conversations, theology, doctrine, belief, orthodoxy, whatever, and it doesn't seem to go anywhere. The train just doesn't ever leave the station. We can't get any traction. We never really get any resolution. And I think a lot of times it's because we're attempting to talk about abstract ideas, right? Like, let's sit down and talk theology, and I'll write down my list of the 10 things I believe, and you write down the list of the 10 things you believe, right? And we'll just, there's a missing ingredient. Where's the love? It doesn't go anywhere because we're having a conversation that's a non-conversation. To do one without the other is madness. And it's also why most often these conversations end up in anger and insecurity and attacking and defending and demeaning and dehumanizing and patronizing. And it's crazy because we've been in those conversations and we've probably wondered, how in the hell is this at all conceivably an expression of Christian faith? How? The authors have seen this firsthand, and I want to say this, and this is really important, especially for collective. The authors have seen this firsthand, but remember, we only get one side of this story. And so I want to say, and granted, I'm reading into the text, I want to say the authors have seen this firsthand. They're probably also guilty of it. They've probably also done this because they're a part of the dysfunction that's going on in their community. They've seen it firsthand. They're probably also guilty of it. You say you know God, but you don't live in love? How? How? You're a liar. Because this is a split, this is a dualism that cannot exist. And I wonder, even for a congregation like Collective, it's very progressive and very open, very willing to sort of take things out and deconstruct and reconsider ideas. I wonder, in the face of all of our conviction, with everything that we've been handed down from the Christian faith and different faith traditions and all the ways we make our own meaning with our belief systems, doctrine, dogma, orthodoxy, confessions, creeds, what does the letter say? Guard love. Guard love. So yeah, believe things. That's fine, right? Construct your belief system. That's great. But if you're going to guard something, guard love. I can almost promise you whatever you think you've built in terms of your belief system will change. And so I wonder what it looks like. And I don't, we're definitely not exempt from this. I wonder what it looks like in all of our obsession, in our preoccupation with being right. And I'm not saying necessarily in conformity with Orthodox Christianity, but let's just say a broader understanding of orthodoxy in which we believe we're right, which is every single person in this room. We like that because being right means we're in control. And if we're in control, we're the gatekeepers of who's wrong. And then we get to control who's in and who's out. And then we get the high ground, which means we get to look down, and we get to make judgments and get to show the way. We get to tell the truth to people that don't have the truth. In the midst of all of that, the question is, what does it mean to guard love? Because, yeah, we like to be right. Fine. Different question. What does it mean to guard love? Because we all know churches and communities and people whose reputation, and it seems their mission, is to guard orthodoxy, to have all the right answers and to impress those upon anyone and everyone they come in contact with. And I think it's much more rare to encounter a church or a community or a group of people where you walk away and you're able to say, wow, I'm not sure I understand. I'm sure there are pieces of that I don't agree with. Everything they think and believe, I'm not sure I agree with everything they confess. And maybe it doesn't quite make sense in my head intellectually, everything that they're talking about. But man, you know what is most important to that group of people? Love. You know what the most important thing is to that group of people? Love. And if anyone were to ask, what is that group of people guarding? Oh, they're guarding love. They're guarding love. Do they believe some things? Yeah. Do they have some convictions? Yeah. Do they have some practices? Absolutely. What are they guarding? Oh, they're guarding love. Vigilantly. They're keeping love. They're obeying love. I can't remember who this is, and I hate it because I'd like to attribute it. This is one of my favorite quotes. The sin that most threatens the future of Christianity is not heresy, but hypocrisy. Powerful. The greatest threat to the future of Christianity is not heresy, but hypocrisy. The danger is not that we're going to have a bunch of people running around with the wrong ideas in their head. The danger is that there's a bunch of people who say they know God, who claim to follow Jesus, who are sure that they have the right confessions and they've got all the right creeds and they've got all the right doctrine nailed down, but they do not live in love. The threat is not heresy. It's hypocrisy. And if you look at the ministry of Jesus and what he's concerned about and what really grinds his gears, he could give a shit about heresy. Over and over and over, what he's calling out is hypocrisy. In fact, he himself is a heretic. He's the one that lives out of sync with the interpretation of his own tradition. It's a part of why he gets killed. What he won't stand for is hypocrisy. I love this. Emmanuel Levinas is an Orthodox Jewish thinker. He defines atheism as subtracting yourself from the other. He says, because this removes your ability to love. You can't subtract yourself from the other. Because remember, there's no such thing as the love of God except for as made complete in love between people. So he says, atheism? You want to talk about being separated from God? That's when you subtract yourself from people. And he defines theism as giving yourself to others, working for justice, giving yourself to that call. And this is just in line with the tradition of the Hebrew prophets. When they speak of the divine, they're talking about righteousness. They're talking about justice. They're talking about caring for the poor and the oppressed. They're talking about equity. I love this. And again, I can't remember who this is. I think it's Rob Bell, maybe. God is not the name we give to a certain arrangement of intellectual furniture in your head. That's not God. God is the name of giving ourselves to the actual love of other human beings. This passage opens, my dear children. There's a lot of speculation about the authorship of the Gospel of John and the letter of 1 John, and wherever you land on this, we can talk about that if you want to. My instinct is, bless you, my instinct is you probably don't write my dear children unless you're a little further along in years, unless you've got some experience. Like, that doesn't make sense. If you got like a 17-year-old who's, my dear children, just doesn't seem like it works. And this is actually a letter in what are called the pastoral epistles. And there is this sense of a maturity. There's some experience. This is a seasoned, compassionate leader. And what's going on is there's a tussle. There's this church controversy. There's maybe even a church split. This is a theologically volatile environment. People are fighting. They don't agree. He says, my dear children, I'm writing to you so you don't sin, but when you do sin, and what's the sin? That's the fascinating thing to me. When I read it, I was like, ooh, this is uncomfortable. I don't want to talk about sin. But the fascinating thing is, what's the sin? Is the sin the vice list on the giant sign in the dude's belt? No. Is the sin that there's a whole other group of people running around and they don't think the right things in their head? They don't believe the right things. No. The sin is hypocrisy. The sin he's talking about is there's a whole bunch of people that say they love God and they don't live in love. And in fact, part of the way we know this is that he uses an almost identical phrase in that first passage. He says, if we say we don't sin, we're a liar and the word is not in us. And then the verse in our passage is, if you say you know him but you don't love, you're a liar. They're like bookends. The sin that he's calling out is not some immoral vice list. He's saying, don't be a hypocrite. Especially in the midst of conflict. Don't claim to know God, but fail to live in love. It's as if this older, wiser, seasoned elder says, my dear children, and remember, this is 100 years now after the historical Jesus, at least. He says, my dear children, I've seen it all. I've been around for a while. I've seen a lot of fights. I've seen plenty of splits. I've seen a lot of factions. I've seen some forgiveness. I've seen a little reconciliation. I've seen a lot of heartbreak. I've seen a lot of hurt feelings. Here's what matters. Love. This is the thing that matters, love. It's like this wise, seasoned leadership of a pastoral voice who's been around long enough to know what holds a community together. And sure, you're going to be easily distracted by a lot of things. Chase those rabbits if you need to. But if you're going to guard something, guard love. Guard love. And this fits in this overall context and in the sort of message of 1 John and the John community from the gospel. It's one that is deeply aware of how dangerous dualism can be, splitting the world into these opposite categories, good and bad, light and dark, here and there, sin and salvation. And I started thinking, what if sin and salvation aren't binary, right? What if it's not like you're here until you're there, and then once you're there, then you're never here, but are in fact on this continuum, always operating concurrently, and they're simply naming the extent to which we are living in sync with love, living in integrity, living in reality, versus living in hate and fear, versus living under our own illusions, versus living hypocritically. What if? I don't know, I'm just thinking out loud. I could be wrong, but it's fascinating. John's community of mystics, and I think this letter in particular, is very focused on integrity. Eternal life now is oneness, it's wholeness. It is an integrated life rather than a disintegrated life. So live in reality. Live in the light. Don't let your illusions deceive you. Walk in reality. Live honestly. I love that. That's how this starts. Live honestly. If you screw up, own it. You being hypocritical, fine. Confess it. Ask for forgiveness. Actually, pursue some reconciliation for a change. Don't get so caught up in your own theological baggage and doctrine that you forget to love. There is no right confession that will ever be more important than love. There is no right confession that will ever be more important than love. This is the life Jesus said was possible, life now. And I'll be the first to admit, it's not easy. It isn't. It's not easy, but it's good. And this is it. I mean, this is the way. This is the really, really difficult way. But it's the way to the unconditional whole life. So the question is, how do we do this? How do we do this? I don't know. I like to say that at the beginning when I ask a question like that. Right, sorry you came out. Can have a refund at the door. I don't know. But Jim Kane was good enough to offer this reflection, which I thought was really, really poignant. And when he asked me these questions, I did the default thing, which is to be like, oh, well, I'm a pastor, and I'm supposed to know the answers to this. So let me start to write my responses. And then I thought, damn, there's a whole group of people I can ask what they think about it. So rather than me answering, we're all gonna answer and think about this. So Jim says, And bear with me, because it opens pretty hot. I couldn't help thinking repeatedly about Trump. Me too. He's made hate and greed popular and okay again. Life is grossly unfair. And one of the most consequential unfairnesses is that it is easier to promote hate than love. It doesn't take much to create hate. You create fear in your group, you demonize the other. Isn't it more difficult to understand how to create love? Is it simply to understand and accept the other? That process seems to cut across the grain of our psychic comfort and requires giving up control and self-focus, and requires potentially unpleasant interactions with persons you fear or despise. And I love this. This is how it ends. Love is the goal, but how do religious beliefs and services do this? I want to come back to this word command, because that was my worry. That was my worry, that after all of this, it is still possible that we could walk away because we've inherited the understanding of religion in the West that is obsessed with orthodoxy, and most of us have never heard of orthopraxy, that we could still walk away from this understanding that because love is a command in the text, that love just becomes the new orthodoxy. That love becomes the new answer that we use to be right over and against everyone else who's wrong. And we very quickly find that we're saying love, but once again, not living it. And so I heard this this week, fascinating rabbinic commentary. I'd never heard this before, but it blew my mind, on the 10 Commandments. So the rabbis would say the first 9 commands are visible, right? They're verifiable. So you can see if somebody murders, you can see if somebody steals, if you're in the right place at the right time, you can see someone commit adultery, you can see someone worship an idol. So it goes on, and they go through the first 9, and they say these are all visible, they're verifiable, but the last one, thou shalt not covet. And they remark, wow, this one's kind of tough. This is a little squirrely, because you can't really tell if someone's coveting. This is invisible. And they say the reason it's invisible is because it's not a command, it's actually the reward. They say, if you live the other 9, you won't want anyone else's life. We would say, oh, I forgot I didn't get that. And my interpretation of that, my paraphrase would be, if you live by the first 9, right? If you live a life in their best understanding, if you live a life that is in sync with God, a life of integrity, a life that's in sync with love, wholeness, you won't want anyone else's life. And I think the same thing is true of the command to love. It is a command that functions as its own reward. If you live a life of love, you won't want anyone else's life because you will have the only life that matters. And that will be fully alive in you, between you and the people that you love. I think this is what the authors of the letter are talking about in terms of eternal life, unconditional life, the wholeness of life experienced now. How do we know that we know God? Love. Love. The greatest command, and also in and of itself, the greatest reward. I'm going to have Andy come and lead us in the Eucharist, and we'll wrap up.
When Ben said that, Clark said that, tell them they're better than this, I just pictured this. He would cross his arms after he said it and just kind of cock his head to the side and give you that. I've gotten that look from Clark Orr before, if you ever get a moment where Clark kind of drops the mic on you. But what hit me is a thought, kind of connecting some circles. There are some of us that are a part of regular conversations about kind of the ongoing life and guidance of Collective and where we're going. And those who have been in those conversations with me from the beginning have known there's one thing I keep saying over and over and over again, and it's only because I hear the voice of a therapist in my head that used to say it to me all the time. Stop defining yourself by who you're not. And we have to find the things that define who we are. To be fully us. Sharon, when you said that about the Eucharist, that the table is open to all people and all are welcome, to me that is one of the single greatest identifiers of who we are as a community. This table is open to all people. And so then I had this crazy thought of what if this meal didn't just stop here, but what if our response to things that we see that are not love in our community became us taking the meal and peeling back the defenses that we have to those other people? What if our response to the street preacher, whether it was Ben on that occasion or anybody that's downtown DeLand on any Friday night, what if the way we shut them up was by putting food in their mouth and then saying, "Hi, my name's Andy. Let me tell you about me," and getting to know you? And if all of that happened one-on-one, how would that look? It would be the outgrowth of this, taken out of this place, because the last thing we want to become is a place where it's all about this. Taking our safe space out and creating those safe spaces of love and acceptance and care and openness and making ourselves vulnerable. For that is the true work of Jesus Christ in the Gospels, not any of the other stuff that anybody screamed for years or learned for years, but the true personhood of Jesus is the self-giving, self-sacrificial love that said, "I will gladly give love to you," and this is what God looks like. So as we come to the table, may we remember that the wheat that has made the bread, the grapes that have made the wine, they have not even reached their full potential, but just becoming what they are. But it's when they become ingested in us and they grow out to become love expressed that they become the full expression of their intention. The table is open.